types of exhortation or encouragement to say, you need to do this. What I'm about to tell you, what I'm about to give you, you need to do it for two reasons. One, and that's what's his purpose now to instruct them, is in two things. How they ought to walk. This is still in verse 1. Just as you have received from us how you ought to walk, and how they ought to please God. He says two things. How you ought to walk and how you ought to please God. So let's talk about those a little bit separately, even though they're together. What does it mean when he says how you ought to walk? How you what? How you live. How you live. Walking is a concept of moving, correct? He doesn't say how you stand in God or where you're at in God. He says how you walk in God. That verb is continual. It's a progression. It's to keep going. So Jason, you've now chosen a life to continue to grow, to continue to move forward. The wonderful decision you made is fantastic, but it doesn't end there. It's actually just the beginning of a walk with God. In chapter 1 of 1 John, one of my favorite verses, if you walk in the light as he is in the light, the blood continually cleanses you. So the blood continually cleanses us if we continue to walk in the light. Not stand in the light, not sit in the light, not go to sleep in the light, walk. So the concept he's talking about is, he says there's two things that I am urging and requesting, I'm call upon you to do. The first one is how you ought to walk, and he's going to give some instructions relative to that. The second thing is how they ought to what? God. How they ought to please God. Pat did a wonderful job last week in his lesson about grace. The grace of God, and is a fantastic lesson. He did a really, really good job. And I'm gonna express to you, I'm gonna admit to you, one of my own faults is part of my thinking is, and this is both spiritually and secularly, am I doing enough? Am I good enough? I have those thoughts. You know, am I earning my paycheck? Am I worthy of the wages that I'm being paid? As well, from a spiritual significance or standpoint, am I doing enough? I suffer from that temptation to think about that. And Pat did a wonderful job talking about grace, and that we can never do enough to earn it. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry? If that's on your mind, then you are doing enough? Oh, okay. Well, that's an interesting way to look at that. Okay, good. All right, good. Yeah. But so the concept of grace, though, is you can swing it too far, though. You can swing it so far that, well, I don't need to do anything because I'm saved by grace. And therefore, I don't need to do anything. And what we find with the Thessalonians, what we'll find is that's actually part of what they were doing. Christ is returning. I've been saved. I don't really need to worry about anything. I don't need to do anything. I'll just wait for him to come back. And so Paul is saying, no. You still need to walk, move forward, and please God, which by inference means we can do things that do not please God. So we can live a life that pleases God. We can live a life that displeases God. Now, we're not earning it. We're not earning our salvation by doing things to please God, because we just can't do that. We're never going to be good enough. We're never going to do things good enough to earn or to be, if you will, worthy of, in the sense of I've done enough, therefore I can cash my check in and I'm worthy in that sense. I am worthy in the sense that God gave his son to die for me. So I am worthy in that sense, but I'm not worthy in terms of what I've done. I'm worthy because God views me as worthy. But I need to live a life pleasing to him. That means I need to do things that are pleasing to him. And Paul's going to give two specific areas of instruction regarding pleasing God here in just a few minutes. But what we'll find is that part of the problem the Thessalonians had is that, well, Jesus is coming back. I don't need to do anything because I'm saved. He's going to come back and get me. I really don't need to do anything. And that's not a good attitude either. In fact, what we historically and what we find we'll see in the reference is that they just quit working too and wanted other people to take care of them. And he addresses that in just a few minutes when he gets down here in about the middle of chapter 4, when he says in verse, I got to get my glasses. I think that's 14. No, verse 11. Verse 12, so that you walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. Be dependent on no one. Part of the reason he said that is because they just quit working. They just quit doing anything. And that was not pleasing in that sense. Okay, so he ends verse 1 by saying that you do this, what you are doing, just as you are doing, that you do so more and more. If you carry the NIV version, the New International Version, does anybody carry the NIV in here? It says that you excel still more, which is actually where the title of the series that we have our commentary for this study on, Excel Still More. There's a podcast for that. And he'll say that phrase again down in verse 10, I believe, that you do so more and more. So, what is the Christian's retirement plan? Is there one? Is there a retirement plan? Boy, I'm seeing some head shaking yes, and I'm seeing some head shaking no. Well, let's do it this way. Let me qualify this for a minute. Is there a I'm sorry? There's no retirement in life. Is there a retirement plan for Christians on earth? No, there's not. There is not a retirement plan for Christians on earth. Now, some of you said, well, the Christian retirement plan is heaven. Okay? I get that. I'm going to throw a wild one at you and say, I don't think that's the case either, because I think when we get to heaven, we're going to be doing work. It's going to be wonderful work. It's going to be pure work. It's going to be the Garden of Eden type work. Okay? We're going to be tending and we're going to be serving the Lord. And in that sense, I won't be retired. It just won't hurt when I do that work. My back won't hurt. My knees won't hurt. I won't get tired of doing that work. That's a whole nother study, but my point, what Paul is talking about is there a retirement plan for Christians on earth? And the answer is no, there's not. We are to continue to do his work, to walk and to please him more and more, to excel still more, continue to do more and more. Keith? Sometimes the roles change, don't they? Yeah, I remember my grandmother, Kelsey, when she got into her older age, she could not go, she couldn't physically attend services. Her physical condition would not allow her to do that. When she was younger, she taught Bible class. She cooked for everybody. In fact, she even talked about having dreams and occasionally nightmares about how much she had to cook for everybody. But that was one of the ways she served, was to cook and prepare, and there was many different ways. But as she got older, she wasn't able to do that physically. But did she still serve? Yes, she did. And what she chose to do was to pray. She prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed. I didn't know that until one day I was visiting with her, and she talked about how often she had prayed for me and prayed for our family. So she continued to serve. It was just as Keith said, it was in a different way because her physical condition wouldn't allow her to do some of those, but she didn't retire. She didn't say, well, I can't do what I used to do, therefore I don't need to do anything. She just changed or shifted how she was serving to continue serving him more and more and more. There is no retirement plan on earth for Christians. There is jobs to do. There is harvest. The harvest is ready. It's plentiful. Laborers are needed. And what that labor that we do may change for us as individuals as we age. That's okay. That's just part of it. That's part of it. But we can continue to serve more and more and more. It was a great encouragement to me to learn that that's how she was serving God. So, no retirement plan. We have to continue to grow. As Christians, we continue to grow. So what are your growth plans? Paul was talking to the Thessalonians, and he says, I urge you to do more and more. He's telling us the same thing, to do more and more. So what are your growth plans? What are your spiritual growth plans? How are you deciding, what have you decided to do to grow this year? You're either growing or you're dying. There is no just sit in one place and just kind of stew, if you will. You're either growing or you're dying. So Paul is wanting and encouraging us to continue growing. So how are you planning to grow? That's walking. That's the progress forward. That's continuing to move forward. And what we find is it's also pleasing to God. It's pleasing to God to do that. We're going to get a little more specific, or Paul gets specific for us in two specific areas in this chapter for us. So let's just keep going and see exactly what he says. In verse 2, Paul affirms that the instructions they had received originated where? From the apostles who received it from the Lord Jesus. So the instructions that he had given them was from the Lord. That's important. It's very important because when we get down into verse 8, he says, specifically regarding sexual immorality, he says, look, if you disregard what you're being taught, you're not disregarding what man has taught, you're disregarding what God has taught. So he affirms that in two spots, that what he's sharing with them is not his ideas, it's the Lord God's idea. Okay, verse 3, he uses one of those church words. Sanctification. We don't use that word outside church, do we? I'm working my cattle, and so I sanctify these cows from these cows. What did I just tell you I did? I separated them. But we don't use that word outside church. That's why I say it's a church word. Sanctification. What does sanctification mean? Say again. Set apart. Another word, a synonym would be holy. Holy. Holy is set apart in how it's used. But sanctification. So in verse 3, he says, for this is the will of God, your sanctification. So it's the will of God that we be what? We be set apart. We be different. Christians are to be sanctified, separated, set apart. Who does that? Do we do that, or does God do that? God does that, but we uphold it. Yes, sir. Yes. Yep. Sanctification is a continuation of being justified. That's exactly right. We're not sanctified once and we're done. You know, I set those cows apart aside and I'm done now. No, why did I set them aside? Well, I put them over here because I was going to work them differently. I was going to treat them differently than these over here. There was a reason for doing that, and that needs to continue. That has to continue. So he talks about the definition of sanctification. Two things in verse 3 is set aside or set apart from what? If you're set apart, that means you're different than something. Different than what? The world. The world. We are to be different from the world. Are we? Are we? Are we really different from the world? When people interact with you, do they see you as different from the world? Hopefully. So what does that mean? What's that look like? Yeah. We live what we're talking about in the world so people can see that. Yeah, absolutely. But are we different? Yeah. Peter talks about being aliens, and aliens are easy to pick out, easy to distinguish. Are you easy to distinguish from the rest of the world? Does your life, what you say, what you do, where you go, where you don't go, what you wear, what you don't wear, how you live, is that different from the world, or do you just blend into the world? Woo, wait a minute now, Paul. You don't have to get so specific. Now, I'm not saying that we can't do things that are in the world. That's not well, we shouldn't drive cars. You know, I mean, we shouldn't drive cars. That because that's worldly, and we shouldn't do that. That's not what Paul's saying, is it? That's not what Paul is saying. He's saying, are you sanctified? That is the will of God. Are you set apart from the world? Are we living lives that when the world looks at us, they say, there is something different about that person. There's something unique. What we're going to find is if we study what God wants us to be, is actually people are going to be drawn to that because it is unique in a good way. Now, there will be some people that rebel against it, fight against it, persecute. The reason that is because our behavior is exposing theirs as negative. That is a very scriptural concept. A lot of times when people are being persecuted for being Christians, the persecutors are being exposed by the actions, the life of the Christian, and they don't like that. So the way to stop that is to squelch the Christian, to squelch the good that makes me look bad. That's a very biblical concept. Well, is that happening? Is that happening? It's His will for me to be separate from the world, to be different, to be distinguished from the world. That's exactly what he says in verse 3. For this is the will of God, that we be sanctified. Now, he gives two reasons in the middle of the chapter. One, verses 3 through 8, is we are to abstain from sexual immorality. He's telling the Thessalonians, abstain from sexual immorality. And he's also then in verse 9 and following, he's saying, now concerning brotherly love, love abundantly, love more and more, excel still more in your love. So he addresses two things specifically for the Thessalonians regarding their sanctification. They're set aside. They're being different from the world. The first is sexual immorality. The second is for them to be people that love people. Is that just a first century message to the Thessalonians? Those two things right there are certainly applicable to today, aren't they? They set us apart. Yeah. Sexual immorality is rampant, isn't it? It's just almost everywhere. You just hardly can't get away from it, if you will. In television shows, in advertisements, in sex sales, right? I mean, that's what advertising says. I mean, it's just that is the world. Satan used it in the first century under the Thessalonians. In the context of the Thessalonians, he still uses it today. Now, it's easy for us to think, well, Michael, in the Thessalonians' time, there was this pagan worship, this pagan concept where you would go to the god of whatever, and they had these temples throughout Thessalonica, and your part of your worship was sexual immorality. We don't have that today, Michael. Well, no, we don't have temples to the goddess Diana and those types of things, but we still submit to our own pleasures and our own lusts of sexual immorality today, just like they did back then, don't we? Satan still uses those same things. He has not changed. And Paul, calling upon the Thessalonians to be pure, the message is for us today as well. We need to be pure. We need to guard ourselves against sexual immorality. But he also, in verses 9 through 12, talks about our love for people. Now, he commends the Thessalonians and saying, look, I really don't need to tell you much about this because you are living it, and so much so that their love is known through all of Macedonia. Most likely what that means is that their contribution, they were sending money, they were sending aid to people throughout the Macedonia region that were in need. They were helping them. They were doing those types of things. That's probably what that means. And maybe it's a physical assistance. Maybe they heard of a terrible storm hit a certain area, so they gather up and they go over and help recover. Whatever it was, that love was very evident. And he says, do that more and more. In Oklahoma, we have what we call an Oklahoma Standard, right? And that's a good thing. When a storm hits, we rally around each other and we help each other. That's a good thing. How do we distinguish ourselves in that? We do it more and more. Do we wait for a crisis before we love our brother and sister? Do we wait until something big happens that everybody knows about before we help our brother and sister? That's a good thing. I'm not, please understand, I'm not being critical. I'm complimenting the Oklahoma Standard. I think that's wonderful. But for us as Christians, he's saying we need to love more and more, excel still more in our love. I would offer to us probably the way to do that most effectively is through the little things that are unseen. Be people that hold the door open for other people. Be people that help people. Be people that are kind. Be people that ask about other people. How are you doing today? And genuinely mean it. And if somebody ask you, how are you doing today? And you're not doing well, share that. Oh, I'm fine. No, I'm really struggling today. If we do that, you're probably going to get one of those blank looks about, oh no, what do I do now? Why? Because if somebody asks, I'm fine. And we're not really fine. Well, you know what? We're not fine. So let's own that let's share that, because part of the way I can love someone is through my own suffering, sharing that with them. How do I love more abundantly? Are we doing that? Are we really, really doing that? Well, we could spend a lot of time here, but he goes on, he says, there's two areas that he emphasizes, and they do apply to us today, the sexual immorality, and then the living for themselves, and then loving others. We are to be different. Okay, I know we've got 5 minutes left, so I want to jump into this last section of chapter 4, because now Paul kind of shifts and transitions into the second coming. Evidently, the second section of chapter 4, evidently there were some issues relative to Christ's return that the Thessalonians had a little bit mixed up. The one that he addresses at the end of chapter 4 is there appears that they had some concerns about if someone dies before Jesus' second return, that they were in trouble, that they wouldn't. So in other words, I have to be physically alive when Jesus returns, otherwise I don't participate in his second coming. That seems to be the thinking that Paul was addressing at the end of chapter 4. Why would the Thessalonians think that? I'm going to offer you a couple of things. Number one, it's probably because Paul wasn't able to instruct them as he wanted to. He was taken away too quickly. So he wasn't able to complete their instruction. He had told them about Jesus coming back, but he hadn't had the opportunity to fully instruct them on that. Remember, too, the world that they were in, which was very heavily pagan. And if you died, where did you go? You went across the river to Hades, and you could be lost in Hades forever. Okay, that was the pagan philosophy of, if I didn't do right, if I didn't have a coin to pay the river crosser on the boat, then my soul might wander forever in a bliss and be lost in Hades. If you're a Disney fan, bear with me on that, and you watch the cartoon Hercules, look at the very end, and when he loses the girl, and Hades throws her into the pit to be there just wandering in pain forever. And he goes and rescues. That would have been part of what they were exposed to. So they would have been concerned. Boy, I don't want to die before Jesus comes back, or I won't be able to participate. Probably not something that's very prominent today, but at the same time, we need to have a full understanding of what's going to happen when Jesus returns. So what he seems to do in in chapter 15, verse 15 and 17. This area is the single fullest description of Jesus' second coming found in the New Testament. Verses 15 through 17, that area, that's the best single example. Now, we can go to some other areas and put things together and have a full understanding of what's going to happen when Jesus returns. But if I want just one single example, this is one of the best. It's one of the fullest. And what it says is that those who died in Christ will be raised up. They will go first. They will go first. Those that are left living, that are faithful to Christ, will follow them and meet Christ in the air. And then we will live with him for eternity. So, probably something that we're all familiar with. Last thing I'll share with you, is there significance in that Paul teaches Jesus meets his people in the air? Yes, there is significance. Because a popular concept is that Jesus is going to return to earth and reign on earth. Paul says Jesus comes and we go to him, and then we live forever and ever. Yes, ma'am. You just want to put it, there you go. Okay. Yeah. Some good teaching there. Some good teaching there. Okay, that was the second bell. We'll get into chapter 5 of 1 Thessalonians next week. Thank you very much.